Stamford, Texas, 1882. A stone commissary beside railroad tracks. Ledgers record cattle sold to buyers who will never see them. Nearly 90% order by letter. Over 500,000 acres at peak. 4 major ranches. 650 miles of wire strung in 3 years. An empire built on correspondence. Impressive. But the brand required backstage machinery. Bunkhouses, supply depots, credit systems, bills of lading replacing trust. The commissary was logistics disguised as ranching. When the empire split in 1978, when Flattop sold in 2019 with mineral rights attached, when a 600-megawatt solar project took the Swenson Ranch name in 2025, the surface kept changing. The extraction continued. Was this a family vision passed through generations? Or an industrial system that kept running regardless of who signed ownership papers? If you're drawn to the hidden mechanics behind America's legendary ranches and the systems that built them, please like and subscribe and tell me in the comments which ranch empire I should explore next. Your support makes these deep dives possible. Chapter 1. The Town Built to Serve the Range. Before Stamford became a town, it was a calculation. Jones County, West Texas, 1883. The Texas Central Railway pushed westward, looking for settlements to justify the track. Towns meant freight. Freight meant profit. But West Texas had more grass than people, more cattle than commerce. The Swensons understood this. They owned land. They needed infrastructure. They made an offer. Give us a station. We will give you a town. The railroad agreed. Stamford rose on Swenson property, laid out in neat blocks with street names that would carry the family identity for generations. The town was a tool, a logistics node designed to gather supplies and distribute them across a sprawling network of ranches that would eventually control land in 5 counties. At 414 South Swenson Street, the commissary took shape. Luder's stone, quarried from Texas limestone beds, cut and stacked into walls built to last. The building opened around 1900. It was not a store in the traditional sense. It was a warehouse, a depot, a control point. Freight trains arrived from Fort Worth and Dallas carrying everything the ranches could not produce themselves. Flour, coffee, barbed wire, nails, lumber, saddles, medicine, boots, tools. The supplies came off the cars and went into the commission, sorted and catalogued. Foremen rode in from the Flattop, from Throckmorton, from Eriksdal, from Tongue River. They collected what their crews needed. They signed for it. The commission kept the records. This was the circulatory system of the ranch network. Stamford was the heart. The rail line was the artery. The commissary pumped goods outward to distant camps where men worked cattle on land so vast they could ride for days without crossing a fence line. But the commissary did more than move supplies. It moved information. Foremen swapped news, cattle prices, weather reports. Which hands were reliable, which weren't. Who was hiring, who had quit. The building was an exchange, formal and informal, where the operations of 250,000 acres or more were coordinated through conversation and ledger entries. The brand itself was a statement of intent. SMS. 3 letters formed by an extended M placed between 2 reversed S letters. Simple, difficult to alter, registered, patented. The mark carried legal weight and market value. It was a promise stamped into cowhide that said these cattle met a standard, that the ranch behind the brand operated with precision. 210 East McHarg Street. This address would become headquarters. Swenson Land and Cattle Company incorporated in 1926. The headquarters marker went up in 1995. a state acknowledgement that what happened here mattered to Texas history. But the headquarters came later. The commissary came first. The system depended on control. Cowboys needed supplies. Supplies came from the commissary. The commissary extended credit. Credit created obligation. A man who owed the company for boots and tobacco and winter gear could not easily walk away. The debt was not crushing. It was binding. This was not unique to the Swensons. It was standard practice across the cattle frontier. But it worked. The town grew around the ranch infrastructure. Businesses opened to serve the cowboys and their families, schools, churches, hotels, saloons. Stamford became real. But it began as an instrument, a place designed to make distance manageable, to turn scattered ranches into a unified operation. The railroad gave Stamford its purpose. The Swensons gave it its shape. And the commissary, solid and stone, became the physical proof that this empire was not just grass and cattle and men on horses. It was logistics, paperwork, coordination, a back-end operation that made the front-stage ranching possible. The commissary still stands. The stone has weathered, but not crumbled. The building is over a century old, a marker of an era when empires were built with supply chains as much as with land and livestock. Stamford remains. Smaller now, quieter, but still the town the Swensons built to feed their vision of what a ranch could become when distance was overcome by organization. But the man who started it all never lived to see the empire reach its peak, and the inheritance he left behind was not wealth. It was a problem no amount of land could solve. Chapter 2. The Man Who Traded Paper for Empires. Svante Magnus Swenson did not arrive in Texas with money. He arrived with timing. 1836. Sweden emptied its young men into ships bound for America. Crop failures, debt, overcrowding, the promise of land ownership across the Atlantic. Svante was among them, 23 years old, leaving a country where his future was already decided by birth and geography. He landed in New York, then moved south. By 1838 he reached Texas, a republic barely 2 years old, still bleeding from its war with Mexico. The economy ran on barter and promise. Cash was scarce. Credit was everything. Swenson understood this immediately. He worked in mercantile trade, goods moving between settlements, supplies for farms and plantations. He was Swedish in a place dominated by Anglo-Southerners, but commerce has no accent. A man who could move products and extend credit found opportunity regardless of where he was born. The plantation economy surrounded him, cotton, enslaved labor. Swenson participated. The historical record confirms this. He owned enslaved people during the 1850s. The Texas State Historical Association notes that he later opposed secession and reportedly sold the people he enslaved by 1861, refusing to support the Confederacy. Whether this was moral conviction or business pragmatism, the sources do not clarify. He opposed secession. He sold the people he enslaved. He refused to aid the Confederacy. The timing was convenient. The morality was claimed. By 1850, Swenson had established himself in Austin, a general merchandise business, a banking operation. He was becoming a fixture in the capital, a man who understood how Texas worked and how to position himself inside its growth. Then came the scheme that would define everything. Texas was land-rich and cash-poor. The state government issued land certificates to finance railroads. These certificates were essentially I owe us. Build track, receive land. The certificates could be traded, sold, transferred. Most settlers did not want paper. They wanted boots, saddles, tools, things they could use immediately. Swenson wanted the paper. He began trading frontier supplies for railroad land certificates. A saddle for a certificate worth 160 acres. Blankets for another claim. Coffee, flour, nails, anything a settler needed more than a future land deed. Swenson accumulated the certificates. Then, starting in 1854, he used his filing privileges to claim massive blocks of state land in West Texas. The land was remote, unimproved. Legally, it belonged to the state until someone filed a proper claim. Swenson filed. The certificates gave him the right. The state validated the claims. What had been open range became Swenson property. This was legal. It was also transformation on a scale few men attempted. He turned goods worth hundreds into land worth thousands, then tens of thousands, then more. The plantation wealth had given him capital. The land certificates gave him territory. Together, they built the foundation for what would become one of Texas's great cattle empire. Swenson did not live to see the full result. He died in 1896 in New York, far from the Texas land that carried his name. He had married, he had nephews. The ranch operations passed to them. They would expand it, they would brand it, they would turn raw acreage into a working system. But the origin remained what it had always been. A Swedish immigrant who understood that in a young republic, paper could become property if you knew which paper to hold and when to file the claim. He was not a cowboy, he was not a cattleman in the traditional sense. He was a merchant who saw land as the ultimate inventory. Buy low with goods, sell high with deeds, or better, never sell at all. Just hold and let the value accumulate as Texas grew around you. The numbers tell the transformation. 1836, emigration from Sweden. 1838, arrival in Texas. 1854, the first railroad land certificate filings. By 1860, Swenson controlled approximately 128,000 acres, valued around $175,000. The peak claim would eventually exceed 500,000 acres after expansion to include Tongue River in 1900 and Spur in 1906. By 1989, more than 300,000 acres remained across multiple counties. The land kept changing hands. The acreage kept shifting, but the pattern held. Paper turned into property. Property turned into empire. The moral question lingers. Can you build a legacy on exploitation and still deserve credit for vision? History does not require heroes to be clean. It only requires them to be effective. Svante Magnus Swenson was effective. Svante Magnus Swenson was effective. But effectiveness and ownership are not the same thing. The land he claimed on paper would require something he never built. Walls. Chapter 3. When Open Grass Required Walls, 1896. Svante Magnus. Swenson died in New York. His sons inherited land they had never managed and a problem their father never solved. The land existed on paper, deeds, certificates, survey maps. But in 1896, West Texas was still mostly open range. Cattle moved freely across unfenced grassland. A man's herd mixed with his neighbor's herd. Ownership meant brands, not boundaries. You proved your cattle by the mark on their hide, not by where they grazed. This system was ending. Eric P. Swenson and S.A. Allie Swenson took control of the family holdings. They formed a partnership. Swenson Brothers. They lived primarily in New York, managing the Texas properties from a distance through hired superintendents and periodic visits. They were not ranchers by upbringing. They were businessmen who owned rangeland. The Texas legislature had begun passing fence laws in the 1880s. Landowners could now legally enclose their property. More importantly, they were increasingly required to. Open-range grazing was being restricted county by county. The era of free grass was dying. If you owned land, you either fenced it or lost control of what happened on it. Fencing was not a convenience. It was infrastructure. It required capital, labor, and constant maintenance. Barbed wire had made large-scale fencing possible. Invented in the 1870s, it was cheap enough to string across miles of prairie. But cheap is relative. Even barbed wire added up when you were measuring fence lines in the hundreds of miles. Posts had to be cut or hauled. Wire had to be purchased, transported, strung, and stapled. Crews had to walk the lines and repair breaks caused by weather, cattle, or wildlife. The Swenson brothers faced a choice: fence the land and turn paper claims into controlled pastures, or sell it and walk away. They fenced. The work began in the 1880s and accelerated through the 1890s. Flattop Ranch, Eriksdal, Throckmorton, Tongue River. Each ranch required its own network of interior and exterior fences. Pastures had to be divided to manage grazing rotation. Bulls separated from cows except during breeding season. Calves weaned in pens, not open country. Fencing allowed control. Control allowed planning. Planning allowed profit. But fencing also created new costs. The wire had to be maintained. Gates had to be installed and locked. Line riders had to patrol the boundaries, watching for breaks and trespassers. A single downed section of fence could let cattle drift for miles, mixing herds and creating chaos during roundup. Then there was water. Open-range cattle drank from creeks and rivers. Fenced cattle needed wells and windmills. If a pasture had no natural water source, the Swensons had to drill. They had to install pumps. They had to build troughs and storage tanks. Water infrastructure became as important as the fence lines themselves. A pasture without water was worthless, no matter how good the grass. The early years were brutal. Alfred Dyer, one of the first superintendents hired to manage the operations, committed suicide in 1886. The historical sources link his death to the strain of drought and the overwhelming challenges of turning scattered land into a working system. The open range had demanded resilience. Fenced ranching demanded engineering. The strain was not just physical, it was psychological. Open-range chaos could be tolerated because no one expected perfect control, but a fenced system created the expectation of total management. Every break in the fence was a failure. Every lost calf was waste. Every dry well was crisis. The responsibility was crushing. Dyer was not the only superintendent to crack under it. He was simply the first. The Swenson brothers hired managers. They installed foremen. They built line camps, small cabins scattered across the ranches where cowboys could shelter during long patrols. They dug wells. They strung wire. They brought in cattle and began the work of building herds that could be tracked, counted, and sold with precision. The shift from open range to fenced property was not romantic. It was mechanical. Posts and wire, wells and windmills, ledgers tracking costs per mile of fence, per head of cattle, per gallon of water pumped. The land had always been there. Now it had to be made productive in a system where boundaries mattered and every resource had to be controlled. This was the inheritance, not just acres, but the obligation to turn them into something that could generate income year after year. The Swenson brothers accepted it. They paid for the wire. They hired the men. They built the infrastructure. And in doing so, they transformed their father's paper empire into a physical one, marked not by survey lines on a map, but by fence posts driven into Texas dirt. The fences were finished, the pastures were ready. But the brothers lived in New York, and running an empire from 1,000 miles away required trusting men they would never fully know. Chapter 4. 650 miles of wire and 38 yokes of oxen. Building a ranch empire in the 1890s looked less like cattle drives and more like construction. The Swenson brothers needed wire, posts, lumber, nails, water tanks, windmill parts, corrugated iron for roofs, tools, feed. Everything required to turn raw prairie into divided pastures with working infrastructure. None of it existed in West Texas. All of it had to be hauled. Abilene was the nearest railhead with reliable supply. 100 miles east of the Swenson ranches, the brothers hired freight teams, 38 yokes of oxen, 76 animals yoked in pairs, pulling wagons loaded with materials across open country. No paved roads, no bridges over every creek, just dirt, grass, and the hope that weather would hold long enough to complete the haul. Oxen were slower than horses, but stronger and more reliable over distance. A team could pull thousands of pounds if the load was balanced and the pace was steady. The wagons moved in trains, multiple teams traveling together for safety and efficiency. Drivers camped along the route. They watered the animals at creeks. They watched for breakdowns. A broken axle or a lame ox could strand a wagon for days. The materials reached the ranches. Then the real work began. 650 miles of barbed wire, strung in approximately 3 years. That number comes from retrospective accounts, estimates built on memory and ranch records. It may be precise, it may be rounded. Either way, it represents a staggering amount of labor. Wire came in spools. Each spool had to be loaded onto a wagon, hauled to the fence line, and unrolled. Posts had to be cut from whatever timber was available or hauled from lumber yards. Holes had to be dug in hard Texas dirt. Posts set. Wire stretched between them. Staples driven. Gates built and hung. The work moved in crews, men walking the line, mile after mile, pasture after pasture. Eriksdal, approximately 50,000 acres, named for Swedish heritage, a nod to Svante Magnus Swenson's origins. Flattop, approximately 41,000 acres, named for the terrain, the flattened mesas that broke the prairie. Throckmorton, approximately 106,000 acres, named for the county, the largest single block in the Swenson network. Each ranch required its own infrastructure: headquarters buildings, bunkhouses for the cowboys, corrals for working cattle, barns for horses and equipment, line camps scattered across the property where riders could shelter during long patrols, chuck wagons and cookhouses to feed the crews, wells drilled and windmills installed to pump water into troughs and tanks. This was not ranching in the old sense. It was engineering. Every pasture had to be planned, grazing rotation calculated, water sources positioned, fence lines surveyed to follow natural boundaries or create them where none existed. The goal was efficiency. Move cattle through a system, fatten them, sell them, repeat. The Swensons bought cattle to stock the new pastures: 1,800 Durham Shorthorns, 180 Hereford Shorthorn crosses, registered Hereford bulls. The Shorthorns were popular in Texas at the time, known for size and beef quality. The Herefords were an investment in genetics, a bet that breeding for specific traits would pay off in higher sale prices years later. The cattle arrived by rail and trail. They were driven onto the ranches, branded, turned loose in fenced pastures where they could be tracked and managed. No more mixing with neighboring herds, no more disputes over ownership during roundup. The fence eliminated ambiguity. The brand confirmed identity, but the fences also created dependency. Cowboys no longer rode free-range. They rode assigned pastures. They checked fence lines. They repaired breaks. They moved cattle between enclosures according to schedules set by foremen and managers. The work became regimented, predictable, industrial. The Swensons were building assets, not traditions. Every mile of fence increased the value of the land. Every well drilled made another pasture usable. Every building constructed supported more operations. The ranch was a real estate project disguised as cowboy country. The brothers invested capital. They expected returns. The cattle were products. The land was a factory floor. The Swensons saw what Texas could become if infrastructure replaced improvisation. They paid for that vision with oxen teams and wire spools and hired labor. And when the fences were finished, when the wells were pumping, when the cattle were grazing in assigned pastures, they had something that could be managed from New York with periodic reports and ledgers. The open range required presence. The fenced ranch required paperwork. The Swensons chose paperwork. But paperwork depended on the men who filled it out. And those men came from places the Swensons had never seen. Chapter 5. The Swedish Pipeline. Eriksdal was not just a ranch name. It was a recruitment system. The name came from Erik Swenson, one of the brothers. The Swedish suffix dal meant valley. Eriksdal, Erik's Valley. But the name carried more weight than geography. It signaled identity. Swedish settlers in Texas recognized it immediately. A Swedish name on a Texas ranch meant Swedish owners, and Swedish owners meant opportunity for Swedish immigrants looking for work. Svante Magnus Swenson had understood this from the beginning. He was not the only Swede in Texas, but he was among the earliest and most successful. When he brought nephews and cousins to help manage the land, he created a network. Swedish family running Swedish enterprises. The network expanded through chain migration. One immigrant arrived, found work, sent word back to Sweden. More immigrants followed. They sought out Swedish employers because language was shared, connections existed, and trust came easier. Texas had multiple Swedish settlements by the late 1800s. New Sweden in Travis County, Swedona in Williamson County, small communities where Swedish immigrants clustered, built churches, farmed, and maintained old country traditions while adapting to Texas heat and English language governance. The Swenson ranches tapped into these communities. Andrew John Swenson arrived from Sweden as a young man. He worked for his uncle, Svante Magnus Swenson. He learned cattle. He learned management. By 1897, he was promoted to superintendent of the ranches. He would later become general manager in 1922, a Swedish immigrant rising through the ranks of a Swedish-owned operation. The pattern was not accidental. The labor advantage was clear. Swedish workers were considered reliable, disciplined, hard-working. Whether this reputation was earned or simply an ethnic stereotype, it functioned as a hiring filter. Foremen looked for Swedish names. Swedish churches became informal job networks. A man who attended services at the Swedish Lutheran Church in the area might hear about openings on the Swenson ranches. He might be vouched for by someone already working there. The ethnic connection greased the hiring process. Eriksdal had its own church, Bethel Lutheran Church, Swedish services, Swedish cemetery. Andrew John Swenson and his wife, Selma Augusta Anderson, would eventually be buried there. The church was a marker of community, but it was also a marker of the labor system. Swedish workers, Swedish management, Swedish owners. The entire operation ran on networks built from shared language and heritage. Ethnic solidarity looked like this: Swedes helping Swedes in a new country, shared identity making hard work more bearable, networks as mutual aid. Labor control looked like this: workers who owed their jobs to family connections were less likely to quit. Bonds that extended beyond the paycheck made them easier to manage. Both patterns used the same church, the same cemetery, the same language. The cowboys themselves left little record of which interpretation felt true. They worked. They were paid $25 to $40 a month, the standard wage for ranch hands in that era. They lived in bunkhouses. They rode fence lines. They branded calves. They moved cattle. The work was the same, regardless of whether they were Swedish or not. But the Swenson ranches had a reputation. They hired Swedes first. If you came from the right community, spoke the right language, attended the right church, you had an advantage. And if you proved reliable, you could rise. Foreman positions, managerial roles, superintendent. The path existed, at least for some. The Swedish settlement pattern left physical traces: churches, cemeteries, family names on gravestones, town names like Eriksdal that carried the old country into Texas dirt. These were not just cultural artifacts. They were infrastructure, social infrastructure, a system for recruiting and retaining labor in a region where reliable workers were scarce, and distances made supervision difficult. The Swenson brothers in New York needed men they could trust to manage operations they rarely saw. Swedish managers hiring Swedish workers created a chain of accountability built on ethnic loyalty. Whether that loyalty was genuine or simply strategic, it functioned. The ranches operated smoothly for decades using this model. And when the Swedish immigrants had children, those children grew up knowing the ranches, knowing the work, knowing the expectations. The labor pipeline became generational. Sons followed fathers into the same jobs on the same land. The system reproduced itself. Eriksdal was named for a valley, but it functioned as a gate, a point of entry for Swedish labor into the Swenson Empire. The church blessed it. The cemetery marked it. The wage records proved it. But ethnic loyalty could only take the operation so far. The Swensons needed more than reliable workers. They needed someone who could turn reliability into profit, someone who understood that in a market built on distance, trust was the only asset that mattered. Chapter 6. The Man Who Made Trust Sellable. 1902. The Swenson brothers hired a manager who would change how the ranches operated. Frank S. Hastings was not family. He was not Swedish. He was a professional cattleman brought in to run operations the owners could not manage themselves from New York. This was a shift. The early years had relied on family members and ethnic networks. Hastings represented something different: expertise purchased, authority delegated, a hired man with real power. The Swenson brothers had built infrastructure: fences, wells, buildings. They had stocked pastures with cattle. But building is not the same as managing. Managing requires daily decisions: which pastures to rotate, when to sell, what to buy, how to handle drought, how to respond to market swings. The brothers could not make these decisions from 1,000 miles away with information that was weeks old by the time it reached them. Hastings could. He arrived with a reputation: cattleman, stockman, someone who understood breeding, markets, and operations. The Swensons gave him authority to make decisions without waiting for approval from New York. This was trust, but it was also necessity. Telegraph communication was faster than mail, but still limited. A manager in Texas needed to act when conditions demanded it. Hastings saw an opportunity in genetics. 1906. He negotiated the purchase of 100 registered Hereford heifers from Armour and Company. Registered meant pedigreed, documented bloodlines, cattle bred for specific traits, size, beef quality, hardiness. The heifers cost more than commercial cattle, but the investment had a multiplier effect. Breed them with quality bulls. Raise the calves. Those calves carried genetics worth advertising, worth selling at premium prices. This was capital investment in biological infrastructure. The fences controlled where cattle grazed. The genetics controlled what they became. Hastings was building a brand based on predictable quality. Buyers would pay more for Swenson cattle if they knew those cattle came from registered stock with proven traits. The Hereford program required patience. Breeding took time. You could not rush biology. But Hastings understood the long game. The Swensons were not looking for quick profits. They were looking for sustained income. Registered Herefords fit that vision. Build the herd, build the reputation. Let both appreciate over decades. Then Hastings did something stranger. He made it possible to buy cattle you had never seen. Mail order sales, correspondence cattle. The concept sounds absurd until you understand the problem it solved. Texas ranchers had cattle to sell. Buyers in other states wanted cattle. But distances made in-person transactions difficult. A buyer in Oklahoma or Kansas or Colorado could not easily travel to West Texas, inspect herds, negotiate prices, and arrange transport. The trip took days. The cost was significant. And even if the buyer made the journey, there was no guarantee he would find cattle that met his needs. Hastings built a system that eliminated the journey. The Swenson ranches published descriptions of available cattle: age, weight, breed, quality grade. Buyers could write letters ordering specific lots. The ranches would load the cattle onto rail cars and ship them to the buyer's destination. Payment happened through bank guarantees and bills of lading. The buyer paid in advance or upon delivery, depending on the arrangement. The cattle arrived sight unseen. This only worked if buyers trusted the ranches to deliver what was advertised. No topping, no cherry-picking the best animals and sending inferior replacements, no misrepresenting age or weight. Hastings enforced strict rules. The cattle shipped had to match the description. Every time, no exceptions. Reputation was the only currency that mattered. One bad shipment could destroy years of trust building. The system worked. Buyers ordered, the ranches delivered, the orders kept coming. By the 1920s, the Swenson ranches would claim that nearly 90% of their buyers had never visited the property. They bought on faith in a brand and a manager's word. Hastings died in 1922. 20 years of running the Swenson operations, 20 years of decisions made daily without owner oversight based on his judgment and the trust the brothers had placed in him. He never owned the ranches. He never shared in the ownership. He was paid a salary to make other men wealthy. The ranches survived his death. Andrew John Swenson, the Swedish immigrant who had worked his way up through the system, became manager. The operations continued. But something Hastings had built remained. The idea that a ranch could be run like a corporation, that trust could be systematized, that cattle could be sold to strangers through paperwork and reputation alone. He professionalized ranching, and the system he created would be tested by forces that no amount of professionalism could control. Chapter 7. Mail Order Cattle. The Mechanics of Trust at Distance, 1922. The Swenson ranches published a booklet, 40 pages describing operations, cattle quality, and purchasing procedures. It was advertising. It was also documentation of a system that should not have worked. The booklet explained how to buy cattle you would never see before they arrived at your loading chute. First, the buyer wrote a letter. The letter specified needs: how many head, what age, calves or yearlings, steers or heifers, weight range if possible. The ranch received the letter and matched the order to available inventory. If the cattle existed, the ranch sent confirmation. Price per head. Estimated shipping date. Payment terms. Payment happened in stages. Some buyers paid cash up front. Others made a partial advance, then settled the balance when the cattle shipped. If the buyer was unknown to the ranch, a bank reference or guarantee was required. The ranch would not ship to strangers without financial backing. This was not generosity. This was risk management. A buyer who could not pay left the ranch holding cattle and absorbing shipping costs with no recovery. The shipping window mattered. Late October through mid-November was common for fall calf sales. The cattle had been weaned. They had gained weight on grass through summer. They were ready to ship before winter hit and before feed costs climbed. Timing, the market, was everything. Ship too early, and the cattle were underweight. Ship too late, and prices dropped as other ranches flooded the market. Rail cars became the unit of measurement. A standard 36-foot stock car held approximately 52 calves. 40 yearlings, if they were larger. The railroad charged by the car, not by the head. Efficient loading meant more profit per shipment. The ranch had to fill cars without overloading. Too few cattle, and you paid for empty space. Too many, and animals could be injured or killed in transit. Nearly 90% of buyers had never visited the ranches. This number appeared in promotional materials. It may have been exact. It may have been an estimate designed to impress. Either way, it represented a radical shift in how cattle commerce worked. Traditionally, you bought what you inspected. You shook hands. You looked the animals over. You negotiated face to face. The Swenson system eliminated all of that. The system rested on one rule: no topping. Topping meant selecting the best animals from a lot and shipping those while holding back inferior cattle. It was common practice on ranches that sold locally. Show the buyer prime stock. Make the sale. Deliver something slightly worse. The buyer might complain, but by then the deal was done. The Swenson ranches could not afford this. Their reputation was their only asset in a mail-order system. One bad shipment to a buyer who had ordered 50 head sight unseen could destroy trust that took years to build. The booklet emphasized this. Cattle shipped matched the description. Age, weight, quality, no substitutions, no downgrades. Buyers who received what they ordered became repeat customers. Repeat customers provided stable income year after year. The short-term profit from cheating one buyer was nothing compared to the long-term value of a reputation for honesty. The bill of lading was the proof. A railroad document listing what was loaded, where it was going, and who was responsible for payment. The buyer received the bill. The bank cleared the funds. The cattle arrived. If the shipment did not match the description, the buyer had documentation to dispute the transaction. The railroad and the banks created accountability that handshake deals never could. Think about what this meant. A rancher in Oklahoma wrote a letter ordering 50 head of cattle. He sent money or a bank guarantee to strangers in Texas. Weeks later, a rail car arrived. He opened the door, and inside were living animals he had purchased based on words on paper. The cattle were real, but the transaction was faith. Faith that the brand meant what it claimed. Faith that the ranch would not cheat him. Faith that 50 head meant 50 head, not 49 plus a cull. This was commerce operating at the edge of what trust could support. The mail-order system ran on specific mechanics. Nearly 90% of buyers had never visited the ranches, according to the 1922 promotional booklet. The shipping window for fall calf sales typically ran from late October through mid-November. A standard 36-foot rail car held approximately 52 calves, or around 40 yearlings if they were larger. Payment mechanics varied by buyer relationship, cash in advance for known customers, partial payment per head with balance due on delivery via bill of lading for established accounts, bank guarantee or reference required if the buyer was unknown. The system moved cattle based on trust verified through banks and paperwork. No inspection, no handshake, just letters and ledgers and the railroad's bill of lading as proof the transaction happened. This was commerce built on paperwork. Letters, bills, bank guarantees, shipping manifests, order forms. The cattle were real. The grass was real. But the transaction existed in documents that traveled faster than livestock and carried more weight than a rancher's word. Was this innovation or necessity? The ranches were remote. Buyers were scattered across multiple states. Bringing them together physically was impractical. The mail-order system solved a logistics problem, but it also created something new. A market based on reputation rather than inspection. A brand that meant more than the mark on a cow's hide. It meant a promise that could be tested every time a rail car door opened at a distant loading dock. Hastings had built the system. The Swensons had endorsed it. The buyers had trusted it. And for decades, it worked. Until the century turned and the system faced pressures that no amount of paperwork could solve. Chapter 8. The men who made the system run. The cowboys on the Swenson ranches were not legends. They were employees. $25 to $40 a month. That was standard wages in the early 1900s. Paid monthly, sometimes quarterly. Cash when possible. Credit at the commissary when cash was tight. The job came with food and shelter. The shelter was a bunkhouse. The food was whatever the camp cook prepared. The work was 7 days a week, unless weather made it impossible to ride. A cowboy provided his own saddle and gear. This was expected. A man who could not afford a saddle could not work cattle. The saddle was an investment, often representing months of saved wages. Bridle, spurs, rope, chaps. These were tools, and tools wore out. Replacing them cost money the ranch did not provide. Bedding was the cowboy's responsibility. A tarp, quilts, and blankets rolled together into what the men called a hot roll. A war bag held smaller items, tobacco, soap, letters, anything that needed protection from weather and theft. The bunkhouse offered walls and a roof, but privacy was non-existent. Men slept in rows, snored, fought, told stories. The nights were loud or silent, depending on mood and exhaustion. Some bunkhouses had nicknames: the dog house, the dive. The names were not affectionate. They were accurate descriptions of buildings that were functional but grim. Wood plank walls, dirt floors in the early years, then rough boards. A stove for heat in winter. No insulation, no running water. The men washed from basins filled at the nearest well or stock tank. Laundry was irregular. The smell was what you would expect from men who worked cattle in all weather and had limited access to clean water. The ranch enforced rules. No gambling was officially allowed, though men played cards anyway. Auction pitch, dominoes, small stakes to pass the time. Music was permitted. Harmonicas. Guitars, if someone owned one. Singing. The booklet published in 1922 described the evenings as filled with chuckwagon josh, jokes, gossip, complaints, the social life of men confined to close quarters with few other outlets. But the work defined everything: fence riding, patrolling miles of wire, looking for breaks. Cattle could push through weak sections. Wire could snap in cold weather or sag in heat. A line rider might spend days alone, riding a circuit, sleeping in a line camp, reporting back to the foreman when the loop was complete. Roundup, gathering cattle from open pastures, branding calves, separating bulls, counting heads, verifying ownership. The work was seasonal but intense. Spring and fall were the heaviest periods. Cowboys worked from dawn until the job was finished, sometimes 16 hours or more. Injuries were common. Horses fell, cattle kicked, ropes snapped under tension and struck like whips. Still hunting, a term the workers used for solo riding, searching for unbranded calves that had been missed during roundup. One man, one horse, covering ground until he found strays. It was monotonous. It was necessary. Unbranded cattle were lost profit. Then there were the men whose names survived because their stories were too strange to forget. John Selmon arrived at the Swenson ranches in 1900, a boy looking for work. He was given a horse that bucked hard. The story, preserved in both ranch records and county histories, says the boy used a big word: scandalous. The horse pitched scandalous. The name stuck. Scandalous John. He became foreman of Flattop Ranch, 40,000 acres under his supervision. He served as a director of the Texas Cowboy Reunion, a civic role that carried weight in Stamford. In March 1966, at an age when most men had long since retired, Selmon was kicked while halter-breaking a colt. The blow required surgeries near his brain. He survived. And he planned to be back in the saddle by July for the reunion. This was not romantic. This was a man who had spent 66 years doing the same work and could not imagine stopping. Mars Joe Eriksson, another Swedish immigrant, another foreman. The county history says he rode out against doctor's orders and died in his saddle. Whether from heart failure or exhaustion, the sources do not specify. His body was found still mounted. The painter Frank Tenney Johnson immortalized him in a work titled The Range Boss, exhibited in New York City. The boss in the painting, the boss dead on his horse, the gap between image and reality was complete. Then there was the wage cycle. Jake Raines worked the Swenson ranches for decades. His employment records survived in scholarly accounts of ranching labor. The records show a loop: reaping, which meant roundup and branding work; fence riding; tanking outfits, which meant maintaining water infrastructure; trail outfits, moving cattle between locations. Month after month, $25, $30, $35, occasional spikes for harder jobs, then back to the baseline. The cycle repeated for years. Raines later became known for his memory. He could identify brands from across a pasture. He could recall cattle transactions from decades earlier. He had spent so much time looking at livestock that his brain had become a living ledger. This was what the work did. It turned men into tools, useful, exhausted, forgotten, unless their deaths were dramatic or their memories unusually sharp. The ranch needed these men. The fences needed patrolling. The cattle needed moving. The infrastructure needed maintaining. But the ranch did not memorialize them. It paid them monthly wages, housed them in rough buildings, and replaced them when they quit or died. The system worked because labor was replaceable. Cowboys were not rare. Men willing to work for low wages in harsh conditions were common enough that the ranch never struggled to fill positions. By modern standards, this looks like exploitation. By the standards of 1900, it was normal. Which reading matters more depends on whether you judge the past by its own rules or by the future it helped create. The men accepted the terms because the alternatives were worse. Farming paid less and required land ownership. Factory work in cities offered steadier hours, but often lower wages and worse conditions. Ranching was hard, but it came with a measure of autonomy. A man on a horse, riding a fence line alone, was not standing in a factory line taking orders from a floor boss. The Cowboys made the Swenson empire possible. They strung the wire, they rode the fences, they worked the cattle, they lived in bunkhouses called the dog house, and rolled their belongings into hot rolls and spent their nights playing cards or singing or staring at walls. And when they were too old or too injured to continue, the ranch let them go and hired younger men to take their place. The system survived because it never relied on any individual cowboy being irreplaceable. Only the system itself mattered. But the system required more than just cowboys and cattle. It required something living beneath the cowboys' feet, something that could die overnight and take everything with it. Chapter 9. 600 horses and the cost of keeping them alive. Cattle were the product. Horses were the infrastructure that made the product possible. At one point, the Swenson ranches owned over 600 saddle horses. This number appears in retrospective accounts of ranch operations. 600 animals that existed solely to carry cowboys across pastures too large to manage on foot. A horse ate every day, grass when available, hay when grass was scarce, oats or other grain during hard work periods. A working horse burned calories the way a truck burned fuel. And unlike a truck, a horse could not be parked indefinitely. It needed care, whether it was being ridden or not. Veterinary attention, hoof trimming, parasite treatment. Broken bones or colic could kill an animal worth months of wages. The ranches bred some of their own horses. Colonel M.B. Lloyd, father-in-law to Burke Burnett, provided the foundation stock for the Swenson horse program. Every horse on the ranches carried the letter L branded on its left shoulder, a mark of lineage, a record of where the animal came from and who was responsible for its breeding. But breeding horses was not like breeding cattle. Cattle produced beef, horses produced labor capacity. A good horse could work for years. A bad horse was dangerous. Cowboys needed mounts they could trust. A horse that spooked easily or refused to work cattle was worse than no horse at all. It created risk, and risk in ranching meant injuries, lost time, and dead animals. 600 horses meant 600 mouths to feed. The ranches cultivated hay, oats, and milo to supplement grazing. Hundreds of acres dedicated not to cattle, but to feed production for the animals that managed the cattle. This was a cost that never appeared in promotional materials. The ranches advertised cattle quality. They did not advertise the expense of keeping a horse herd functioning. Then there was water. Every pasture needed a source. Creeks and rivers provided some relief, but West Texas was dry most of the year. Wells had to be drilled, windmills installed to pump groundwater into troughs and storage tanks. The windmills turned when the wind blew. When the wind stopped, the water stopped. Backup systems were required, hand pumps, gasoline engines in later years. Water was not free. It was engineered and maintained. A windmill needed greasing. Bearings wore out. Blades bent in high winds. The towers rusted. A broken windmill meant no water. No water meant cattle moved to other pastures, overgrazing areas that still had functioning wells. Or cattle died waiting for repairs that came too slowly. Troughs leaked. Tanks cracked. Water lines froze in winter. The maintenance never ended. Cowboys checked water sources during fence patrols. They reported problems. Repair crews addressed them when materials and time allowed. The system worked most of the time. When it failed, the consequences were immediate. Brush management added another layer of cost. Mesquite trees spread aggressively across Texas rangeland. They grew fast. They competed with grass for water. A pasture thick with mesquite was a pasture losing productivity. The ranches started a mesquite eradication program around 1940. Men cut trees, burned stumps, poisoned roots. The work was slow and expensive, and the mesquite kept coming back. This was ecology as labor. The land was not static. It changed. Grass grew and died. Trees invaded. Soil eroded. Creeks shifted. Managing the land meant constantly fighting natural processes that worked against ranching. The myth was cowboys on horses chasing cattle across open grass. The reality was men on horses maintaining infrastructure that kept the grass usable. By the early 1970s, the Swenson ranches were running approximately 16,000 Hereford cows across registered, purebred, and commercial herds. That number represented decades of genetic investment, buying quality bulls, breeding selectively, culling inferior animals, building a reputation for producing cattle that met market standards year after year. But those 16,000 cows required feed, water, veterinary care, and pasture rotation to prevent overgrazing. The horses that worked them, the men who rode the horses, and the infrastructure that supported the men, every layer created costs. Some were visible, like wages and fence materials. Others were hidden, like the hours spent greasing windmills, clearing mesquite, or hauling hay to winter pastures. The operating system was biological and mechanical at once. Horses and cattle were living components. Fences and windmills were mechanical components. Both required inputs, both degraded over time, and both needed replacement eventually. The system only worked if every component functioned well enough to keep the whole machine productive. The ranches invested in improvements: brush control, water infrastructure, and better genetics. These were long-term bets that the land could produce indefinitely if managed correctly. But management also meant constant intervention. The land was never allowed to be wild. Every acre was assigned a purpose, producing grass to feed cattle and generate revenue. The operations scale demanded industrial animal management. At one point, the ranches owned over 600 saddle horses. By the early 1970s, approximately 16,000 Hereford cows were produced across the registered, purebred, and commercial herds. A 1989 snapshot recorded an average of 8,500 cattle sold annually, mostly Hereford and Angus, alongside hundreds of acres cultivated in hay, oats, and milo. By 2007, the registered Hereford program had contracted to approximately 180 head inside a broader commercial operation. The numbers shifted with markets and management, but they always represented the same calculation. How many animals could the grass support? How much infrastructure did supporting those animals require? How much labor did the infrastructure demand? The horses made it possible. 600 of them, branded with an L, ate hay grown on cultivated fields, drank water pumped from engineered wells, and carried men across pastures that required endless maintenance to remain productive. The horses were tools, expensive tools that ate, died, and had to be replaced. But even the best tools could not protect against the collapse that was coming. When the price fell, it fell so fast the system had no time to adjust. Chapter 10. When 49, Dollars became 6, 1927. A yearling steer sold for approximately $49. This price appears in retrospective accounts of the era. It may be exact, it may be an average. Either way, it represented a functional market, a price that allowed ranches to cover costs and generate profit. By the early 1930s, that same yearling sold for approximately $6. The collapse was not gradual, it was structural. The stock market crashed in October 1929. Banks failed, credit disappeared, businesses closed, unemployment climbed, people stopped buying beef. Demand fell faster than supply could adjust. Ranchers who had spent decades building herds found themselves with animals they could not sell at any price that made economic sense. $6 per head did not cover the cost of raising a yearling. Feed, water, labor, veterinary care, fence maintenance, taxes, insurance. A yearling represented months of grass consumption, days of cowboy wages, hours of fence patrol, gallons of pumped water. $6 was less than the cost of shipping the animal to market. Ranchers faced a choice: sell at catastrophic losses and hope to survive with whatever capital remained, or hold the cattle and wait for prices to recover. Bleeding money every month, the market stayed depressed. The Swenson ranches hold. This was not sentiment. It was calculation. The ranches had capital reserves built over decades of profitable operations. The land was paid for. The infrastructure existed. Fixed costs were manageable if variable costs could be controlled. Selling herds at $6 per head meant locking in losses that could destroy the operation permanently. Holding meant enduring years of negative cash flow with the gamble that markets would eventually stabilize. Not every ranch had this option. Smaller operations with debt obligations had to sell. They dumped cattle onto a market already oversupplied, driving prices even lower. Those ranches disappeared. The land was sold to cover debts. The owners walked away with nothing. Some of those ranches never came back. The families lost everything in a single market cycle. The Swensons survived because they could afford to wait. This was privilege disguised as resilience. They had capital. They had diversified income streams. They had access to credit when credit was available. Smaller ranchers had none of these advantages. When the market collapsed, they collapsed with it. Labor took the hit. Wages were cut or eliminated. Cowboys who had worked the ranches for years were let go. The ones who stayed accepted reduced pay. $25 a month became $15. $15 became $10. Some worked for room and board alone, gambling that the ranch would survive and wages would return when markets improved. The ranches reduced operations. Fewer cattle meant fewer cowboys needed. Pastures that had been fully stocked were left partially empty. Maintenance was deferred. Fences that needed repair were patched instead of replaced. Windmills that broke were fixed with salvaged parts instead of new components. Every expense that could be delayed was delayed. And still, the ranches bleed money. Taxes had to be paid. Insurance had to be maintained. Minimum staffing had to be preserved, or the infrastructure would collapse entirely. The Depression did not pause costs. It only eliminated income. But something else happened in Stamford during this period. 1930. 13 Stamford businessmen, including ranch managers and civic leaders, founded the Texas Cowboy Reunion. The first event drew 98 cowboys and approximately 12,000 attendees. By 1937, the crowd had grown to roughly 70,000 over the event window. This was not escapism, it was economics. The reunion brought people to Stamford. People needed food, lodging, supplies. Money flowed into the town. Hotels filled, restaurants served meals, stores sold goods. The reunion created cash circulation in a region where cash had become scarce. The event also served a symbolic function. It celebrated cowboy culture at a moment when that culture was being crushed by market forces. Cowboys who could not find work came to compete in roping and riding events. Some won prize money. Others just reminded themselves that the skills still mattered, even if the market did not value them. Was the reunion a gift to the community or a survival tactic for the ranches? Both readings work. The event generated goodwill. It created economic activity. It tied the ranches to Stamford's identity in ways that made separating them politically and economically difficult. And it provided a distraction from the fact that yearlings were selling for $6 and the cowboy way of life was hanging by a thread. The Depression eventually ended. Markets recovered. Cattle prices climbed. By the 1940s, ranching was profitable again. The Swenson ranches resumed normal operations. The cowboys who had been let go found work elsewhere or returned. The infrastructure that had been neglected was repaired. But the collapse left a lesson. Markets could destroy in months what took decades to build. Survival required capital reserves deep enough to outlast disaster. And capital reserves required profits in good years that far exceeded what was needed for operations. The ranches had to extract more from good markets to survive bad ones. The price drop from $49 to $6 was not unique to the Swensons. It hit every ranch in Texas. But only the ranches with resources survived. The rest became land sales, absorbed by larger operations or broken into smaller parcels. The Depression did not kill ranching. It consolidated it. Wealth concentrated in the hands of those who could endure the lean years. The Swensons endured, and when the crisis passed, they emerged with their land intact, their infrastructure functional, and their position in the market stronger than before. They had capital reserves built over decades. They had diversified income. They had access to credit when credit disappeared for others. The smaller ranches had none of these advantages. Chapter 11. 98 Cowboys and 12,000 Witnesses. 1930. Stamford, Texas. Cattle markets had collapsed. Banks were failing. Ranch wages were being cut or eliminated entirely. 13 businessmen decided this was the perfect time to start a rodeo. They called it the Texas Cowboy Reunion. The name was deliberate. Reunion, not competition. Reunion, not show. The framing suggested something authentic. Cowboys coming together, not performing for tourists, but gathering among themselves. The marketing was subtle but effective. The organizers were local business leaders, men whose livelihoods depended on the ranches remaining functional and Stamford remaining relevant. Among them was Axel Magnus Godfrey Swenson, born at Ellerslie Ranch in 1900, University of Texas football letterman, known as Swede. He understood promotion. He understood branding, both the literal kind burned into cowhide and the metaphorical kind that shaped public perception. The first reunion drew 98 cowboys. These were working ranch hands. Men who knew how to rope because they roped cattle for wages. Men who could ride broncs because breaking horses was part of the job. The skills were real. The performance was new. Approximately 12,000 people attended that first event. 12,000. In a town whose permanent population numbered in the hundreds, the visitors needed places to stay, food to eat, supplies to purchase. They brought cash into a region where cash had become desperately scarce. Hotels filled for the first time in months. Restaurants served meals to customers who actually had money. The reunion was entertainment, but it was also economic stimulus in a package that did not look like charity. The event returned each year. The crowds grew. By 1937, approximately 70,000 people attended over the event window. 70,000 visitors to a small West Texas town required infrastructure, parking, sanitation, crowd control, security. The logistics were massive. The payoff was worth it. 3 days of visitors spending money in Stamford generated income that sustained businesses for months. Swede Swenson became the face of the reunion. He organized, he promoted, he made connections with politicians and press. In 1940, he added a quarter-horse show to the event schedule. This was strategic. Quarter horses were working ranch horses, fast over short distances, reliable, the kind of animal a real cowboy rode. Showcasing quarter horses reinforced the authenticity narrative. This was not circus entertainment, this was ranching culture on display. But the reunion created a strange dynamic. The cowboys competing were often the same men who had been laid off or seen wages slashed during the Depression. They performed skills they had developed through low-paid labor on ranches that could barely afford to keep them. The crowds watched and applauded. The prize money helped, but it was a fraction of what steady ranch work would have paid. The cowboys were celebrating skills that had economic value in theory, but paid poverty wages in practice. The audience saw independence and authenticity, men who lived by their abilities. Cowboys as symbols of self-reliance. The reality was different. Cowboys were employees. They worked for wages set by ranch owners. They lived in bunkhouses. They ate food provided by the ranch. Their autonomy was performance, not structure. The reunion amplified the performance. It removed the context. No one talked about the doghouse bunkhouses. No one mentioned the $25 monthly wages that had dropped to $15 or $10. No one discussed the injuries or the monotony or the fact that most cowboys would never own land or cattle themselves. The reunion presented the skills without the system. This was myth-making in real time. The myth had truth in it. The skills were genuine. The cowboys were authentic. But the myth was selective. It highlighted what looked romantic and buried what looked exploitative. Stamford's identity fused with the event. The town became the home of the Texas Cowboy Reunion. This mattered. It gave Stamford cultural weight, newspaper coverage, political attention, a reason to exist beyond serving as a supply depot for distant ranches. The reunion made Stamford visible, and the Swenson family remained central to that visibility. Swede as organizer, other family members as sponsors and participants. The reunion was a community project, but the Swenson influence was undeniable. The family had built the town. They employed much of the workforce. They funded civic projects. And now they anchored the cultural event that defined the town's public image. This was comprehensive power. Not overt control, not dictatorship, but influence woven into every layer of community life. The reunion benefited the town. It also benefited the ranches. Positive association, public goodwill, cultural legitimacy. The event served multiple purposes simultaneously. Was this civic investment or self-interest? The reunion created real economic opportunity. It preserved cowboy skills that might have vanished as ranching mechanized. It gave Stamford an identity beyond its economic dependence on a single industry. But it also sanitized that industry. It presented ranching as freedom when the structure was control. It celebrated labor while obscuring the wages and conditions that defined that labor. Both readings are valid. The reunion was a genuine community celebration and strategic branding exercise. It honored real skills and erased real costs. It created economic activity and concentrated influence. The ambiguity was not accidental. It was essential to the reunion's success. The event continues today. Decades later, Stamford still hosts the reunion. The format has changed, the crowds are different, but the core remains. Cowboys competing, audiences watching. A small town celebrating a version of ranching culture that highlights skill and hides systems. The Swenson name appears in the reunion's history. The connection persists. Whether that connection represents legacy or leverage depends entirely on which version of the story you choose to believe. Chapter 12. The revenue that came from below. Oil changed the math. For decades, the Swenson ranches operated on a single equation: grass-fed cattle. Cattle sold for profit. Profit paid for operations and maintenance. Good years generated surplus. Bad years consumed it. The land's value was what grew on top of it. Then wells started producing, and what came from beneath the surface generated revenue that dwarfed what grazed above it. The timing is unclear from available records. Oil production in West Texas accelerated in the 1920s and 1930s. The Swenson holdings sat in counties where drilling activity was increasing: Jones, Haskell, Stonewall, Throckmorton. These were not the massive fields like Spindletop or East Texas, but they produced. And production meant royalties. Mineral rights in Texas are legally separable from surface rights. A rancher can own the land and lease the minerals to an oil company. The company drills, the company extracts. The rancher receives a percentage of the revenue, typically 1/8, though terms vary by contract. The rancher does not operate the wells, does not maintain them, does not bear the cost of drilling dry holes, just collects checks when production happens. This is passive income, the purest kind. Money that arrives regardless of weather, cattle prices, labor costs, or fence maintenance. Oil royalties do not care if it rains. They do not depend on grass quality or calf survival rates. They flow as long as the wells produce. The Swenson ranches began receiving oil revenue sometime in the early to mid-20th century. The exact figures are not publicly available, but the 1989 snapshot from the Texas State Historical Association mentions some oil interests. That phrasing is deliberately vague. Some could mean a few wells generating modest royalties, or it could mean significant production subsidizing ranch operations. What is clear is that oil revenue changed the financial structure. Ranching became one income stream among several. Surface operations generated profit from cattle. Subsurface operations generated profit from oil. The land produced value vertically, grass on top, petroleum below, both extractable, both profitable. This created a new kind of stability. Bad cattle markets no longer threatened the ranch's survival the way they had during the Depression. Oil royalties could cover fixed costs even when cattle sales were weak. The ranch could hold herds through downturns without facing catastrophic losses. The underground cushion absorbed shocks that would have destroyed operations dependent solely on livestock. But oil also distorted incentives. A rancher managing land solely for cattle makes decisions based on grass, water, and herd health. A rancher receiving oil royalties has different calculations. Surface damage from drilling might reduce grazing capacity. But if the royalty checks are large enough, the damage is worth it. Roads cut across pastures to access well sites. Pipelines cross grazing land. Storage tanks occupy acres that could otherwise grow grass. The surface is subordinated to the subsurface. There is also the question of long-term land use. Cattle ranching requires maintaining grass quality across generations. Overgrazing today reduces productivity tomorrow. A rancher thinking in decades manages carefully. But oil is finite. Wells deplete. A rancher receiving substantial oil revenue might make different choices about land stewardship if the oil income is temporary and the incentive is to extract maximum value while it lasts. The Swenson family maintained ranching operations even as oil revenue grew. This was not universal. Some Texas ranchers sold surface rights entirely once mineral income became substantial. The land stopped being rangeland and became lease territory for drilling companies. Cattle disappeared. Wells multiplied. The transition from ranch to oil field was complete. The Swensons did not make that choice, at least not entirely. Ranching continued. Cattle sales continued. The SMS brand remained in use. But the financial foundation had shifted. The ranch was no longer purely a cattle operation. It was a diversified land-use portfolio. Livestock, oil, hay production, each component generating revenue, each subject to different market forces. Mineral rights also became a tool for estate planning and corporate restructuring. A family could divide surface rights and mineral rights differently. One heir gets the land, another gets a share of the oil royalties. Or mineral rights are retained when surface land is sold, creating ongoing income from property no longer owned. This added complexity to ownership structures. A buyer purchasing ranch land might own the surface but not the minerals. The oil checks go to someone else. The subsurface and surface are severed legally and economically. This would become critical later. When the Swenson Empire split in 1978, mineral rights were part of the negotiation. Who got which wells, which leases, which royalty streams? The surface might be divided by carrying capacity and manageability, but the minerals added another dimension: revenue that existed independent of cattle, revenue that could be split fractionally across multiple entities. Oil did not kill ranching on the Swenson properties, but it changed what ranching meant. The land was no longer just a factory for beef production. It was a platform for multiple extraction systems: grass and petroleum, cattle and crude, the surface story and the subsurface reality. Both valuable, both controlled, both contributing to a balance sheet that no longer resembled traditional ranching economics. The Swensons kept both systems running, cattle on the surface, oil below, but the hierarchy had shifted. The ranch was no longer defined by what grew on it. It was defined by what could be extracted from it. And extraction, whether biological or geological, only works as long as something remains to extract. The mineral wealth solved one problem, but it created another that money could not fix. Too many ears, too many competing interests, too many people who wanted different things from the same land. Chapter 13. The Year One Empire became 4. 1978. The Swenson ranches faced a problem that no amount of capital or infrastructure could solve: too many heirs. Swante Magnus Swenson had died in 1896. His sons had inherited the land and expanded it. Those sons had children. Those children had children. By the late 1970s, multiple branches of the family held stakes in the ranch empire. Each branch had different financial needs, different visions, different levels of involvement in actual operations. The original structure no longer worked. One unified operation required consensus among family members scattered across states, living different lives, with conflicting priorities. Some wanted to expand. Others wanted steady income. Some wanted active management roles. Others wanted passive investment returns. The ranch had become a family corporation, and family corporations fracture under their own complexity. The solution was division. 1978. The Swenson ranches split into 4 separate companies. The rationale cited was carrying capacity and manageability. Different land parcels could support different herd sizes. Different properties required different management approaches. Splitting allowed each unit to operate independently, making decisions faster without requiring approval from distant family members with divergent interests. This was presented as modernization, a practical response to scale and succession challenges, but it was also surrender. Surrender to the reality that empires do not survive intact across generations. They fragment, they divide, they become smaller pieces operating under familiar names with reduced scope. The 4 companies took shape. Flattop Ranch and a portion of the Throckmorton holdings were consolidated under Swenson Land and Cattle Company. Later, the name would revert to Swenson Land and Cattle Company in 1998. This unit controlled approximately 46,000 acres across Jones, Haskell, Stonewall, and Throckmorton counties, plus leased operations elsewhere. The headquarters remained in Stamford. This was the flagship. The company that would carry the Swenson name forward. Throckmorton West became Throckmorton Land and Cattle, approximately 46,000 acres. This unit would remain in family hands until 2001, when it was sold to Ross McKnight. Surface rights and minerals together, a complete transfer. The Swenson connection to that land ended with the sale. Throckmorton East became SMS Ranch Company, approximately 45,000 acres, sold in 1982 to Lester Clark. Part of the transaction included Circle Bar Ranch in South Dakota, approximately 33,230 acres. The SMS Ranch Partnership would later manage SMS Dakota operations and Texas mineral interests. The corporate structure was evolving beyond simple land ownership into a web of entities managing different asset classes. Tongue River Ranch, approximately 77,000 acres. Surface ownership would change hands multiple times in subsequent decades, but mineral rights remained fractured. Partial ownership, royalty shares, executive rights transfers. The subsurface and surface divorced completely, creating legal and financial complexity that persists. Mineral rights became the complicating factor in every transaction. The 4 companies held fractional shares across different areas. Quarter shares were common, but executive rights, the authority to lease minerals and negotiate terms, could be transferred separately. A family member might own a royalty share but lack control over leasing decisions, or hold executive rights but only a small percentage of actual production revenue. This created misaligned incentives. Surface owners wanted to preserve grazing land. Mineral rights holders wanted maximum extraction. Pipeline easements crossed pastures. Well pads occupied grass. Access roads fragmented range. Each decision required negotiation between parties with different priorities and different revenue sources. The split did not end the Swenson ranching empire. It redefined it. 4 companies instead of 1, each operating independently, each making decisions based on its own balance sheet and ownership structure. The SMS brand continued. The Swenson name persisted, but the unified system was gone. By 1989, the corporate structure had stabilized. The New York offices were housed in the First City National Bank building. Wilson Elmore served as president. Gene and Carl Swenson handled operations and land development. The management was professional. The family remained involved, but at a distance. The ranches ran as businesses, not as family estates. Was this necessary evolution or tragic fragmentation? Both readings hold. Evolution, in the sense that splitting allowed each unit to operate more efficiently without the drag of consensus building across a dispersed family. Fragmentation, in the sense that the original vision of a unified empire was abandoned. The whole was greater than the sum of its parts, and now there were only parts. The 1978 split marked the end of the Swenson Empire as a singular entity. What followed were successor companies operating independently, sharing a name and a history, but no longer bound by unified ownership or coordinated strategy. The land remained. The cattle remained. The infrastructure remained. But the coherence was gone. Empires do not die suddenly. They divide. They sell pieces. They become smaller versions of what they were. The Swenson ranches followed this pattern. 1978 was not collapse, it was transition. From one large operation to four smaller ones, from family control to corporate management, from unified vision to independent decision-making. The process would continue. More sales, more restructuring, more complexity. But 1978 was the pivot. The year the empire stopped being an empire and became a portfolio of related but separate holdings. The brand survived. The name survived. The unity did not. And 41 years later, one of those pieces would go to market, not as a ranch, as a product. Chapter 14. Flattop for sale. When a ranch becomes a specification sheet. 2019. Flattop Ranch went to market. Not quietly, not through private negotiation, through a professional listing with printed materials, digital marketing, and a price tag that treated 41,000 acres like a commercial real estate portfolio. The sale was framed as a family decision. Majority rule, no feud, no forced liquidation, just recognition that the current generation of Swenson family members had different priorities than their predecessors. Some wanted to continue ranching, others wanted liquidity. The majority voted to sell. The ranch would be marketed to buyers who could operate it as a working property, ranch to ranch. That was the stated intent. The listing materials told a different story. 41,000 acres, plus or minus, approximately 34,000 classified as rangeland, 6,300 as cultivation, 700 as other categories, roads, buildings, pens, infrastructure that occupied space but did not produce grass or crops. The land was not presented as a unified whole. It was broken into components, each component assigned a category. Each category assigned a value proposition. Stocking capacity was framed as 850 to 1,000 cow units. The example inventory provided to potential buyers listed 855 bred cows, 19 bulls, approximately 215 replacement heifers. These were not abstract numbers. They represented the biological carrying capacity of the land as currently configured. How many animals the grass and water could support without degradation. This was the baseline, the floor. A buyer could theoretically run more cattle, but only by accepting higher risk of overgrazing and reduced herd health. The infrastructure list read like an industrial inventory. 166 miles of fencing, 40 water wells, 25 miles of water lines connecting wells to troughs and tanks. Over 100 troughs, 140 tanks and ponds, approximately 7 miles of the double mountain fork of the Brazos River forming part of the boundary, 17 sets of cattle pens scattered across the property, named operational nodes, headquarters, Taylor Camp, Farm Center, Grow Yard. The grow yard was particularly telling. This was not traditional ranching. This was a feedlot operation integrated into the ranch. Weaned calves placed on wheat pasture, 5 to 6 months of intensive feeding, 250 pounds of gain per animal. Then sale. The grow yard turned grass into weight gain on a schedule. It was agriculture disguised as ranching, optimized, calculated, industrial. Then the listing shifted to revenue streams that had nothing to do with cattle. Pipeline easement, $1.3 million, already paid. A one-time payment for allowing a pipeline to cross ranch property. The pipeline delivered value to someone else. The ranch received cash for granting access. The easement was permanent. The payment was not recurring, but it represented capital that could be factored into the purchase price or used to justify financing terms. Oil and gas royalties. The listing claimed some production existed. The details were vague. Claims, not guarantees. The buyer would need to verify with actual lease documents and production records, but the implication was clear. Buy the ranch, receive royalty checks, passive income from subsurface extraction alongside surface cattle operations. 25% of mineral rights claimed to convey with the sale. 25%. Not full ownership, not even majority control. A minority stake in whatever existed below the surface. The other 75% was held elsewhere, by other family members, by previous buyers, by entities created during earlier splits and sales. The subsurface was fractured. The surface buyer would own a quarter of mineral potential, assuming the claim was accurate. Wind lease royalty reserved. The seller intended to keep revenue from wind energy leases even after the surface sold. Turbines could be installed on ranch property. The electricity generated would create income. That income would flow to the seller, not the buyer. The buyer would own the land and manage the cattle and maintain the fences while someone else collected checks from wind companies. This was land as a platform for multiple extraction systems: cattle, oil, gas, wind, pipelines, each generating revenue, each controlled by different parties, each requiring separate agreements and ongoing management. The buyer was not purchasing a ranch. The buyer was purchasing a stake in a complex asset with competing uses and divided rights. The listing price was not publicly disclosed in available sources, but the structure was clear. The value was not just grass and water. It was infrastructure, easements, royalties, partial mineral rights, revenue potential from sources that had nothing to do with raising cattle. A buyer evaluating Flattop had to calculate returns from livestock, from oil checks, from pipeline payments, from potential wind leases. Traditional ranch economics no longer applied. Was this the future of ranching or the end of it? A working ranch that generated income from a dozen sources, most of which required no cows. A property where the surface operation was secondary to the subsurface and easement revenue. The listing presented this as opportunity. Diversified income, reduced risk, multiple revenue streams protecting against market downturns in any single commodity. But it also meant the ranch was no longer defined by ranching. It was real estate, infrastructure, access rights, mineral claims, wind potential. The cattle were almost incidental, a traditional use that could continue but was not essential to the property's value. Flattop sold. The buyer remains in available records. Whether they continued cattle operations or pivoted to other uses is unclear. But the listing revealed what the Swenson empire had become: not a ranch that occasionally produced oil, an asset portfolio that occasionally ran cattle. The transformation was complete. Chapter 15. 600 megawatts and a name that outlives its owners. October 27, 2025. Engie, a French energy company, announced a new solar project in Stonewall County, Texas. 600 megawatts of generating capacity. Output contracted entirely to Meta, the parent company of Facebook. Commissioning target, 2027. The project would generate electricity for data centers, powering servers and cooling systems hundreds of miles away. The name of the project, Swenson Ranch Solar. The press release did not specify land ownership. It did not confirm whether the Swenson family or any Swenson corporate entity owned the property where the panels would be installed. The name could indicate ownership, or it could indicate location, historical association, regional identity. The solar project carried the Swenson name, but the connection between that name and actual control of the land was unclear. This is how brands outlive empires. The name persists even when ownership changes. Swenson Ranch Solar invokes legacy. It suggests continuity with the ranching empire that once controlled over 500,000 acres across West Texas. But legacy is not the same as ownership. A name can be licensed, borrowed, applied to a project that has no operational connection to the family or company it references. What remains of the working ranch operation is difficult to pin down with precision. Modern sources provide conflicting acreage figures. Approximately 46,000 acres in one account, 54,000 in another, 60,000 including leased operations in a third. The discrepancies reflect different definitions: owned versus leased, surface rights versus total controlled area, year of measurement, ranch boundaries shift, leases expire or renew, definitions change depending on who is reporting and why. What is consistent is that cattle operations continue. Hereford and Angus herds. The genetics program that Frank Hastings started in 1906 persists in some form. Registered bloodlines still matter. Buyers still pay premiums for cattle with documented pedigrees. The SMS brand, the extended M between two reversed S letters, remains in use. The brand carries a United States patent. It functions as intellectual property, a legal asset separate from the land or the livestock. Stamford endures. The Texas Cowboy reunion still happens. The town's identity remains tied to ranching culture even as the ranches themselves become smaller and more fragmented. The Swedish communities that fed labor into the Swenson operations have largely assimilated. The churches remain. The cemeteries hold gravestones with Swedish names. But the pipeline of immigrant workers dried up decades ago. The labor system evolved. Mechanization reduced crew sizes. What once required dozens of cowboys now requires a handful and machines. The commissary building at 14 South Swenson Street still stands, Luder's stone, over a century old. It is a landmark now, a reminder of when Stamford was the nerve center of an empire built on logistics and control. The building no longer serves its original purpose. It does not distribute supplies to distant ranches, but it marks the place where the system operated. The headquarters at 210 East McHarg Street has a historical marker, placed in 1995. The text acknowledges the Swenson Land and Cattle Company's role in Texas history. Incorporated 1926. Headquarters established 1927. The marker freezes the story at a moment of coherence, before the splits, before the sales, before the name became more valuable than the unified operation. What the Swenson story reveals is a pattern. Paper ownership becomes fenced property. Fenced property becomes branded trust. Branded trust becomes corporate structure. Corporate structure becomes fragmented assets. Fragmented assets become marketing labels. The land remains. The use changes. The name persists. Is this continuity or extraction? The solar project continues a tradition of extracting value from Texas dirt. First, it was grass fed to cattle, then oil pumped from beneath the surface, then pipeline easements sold for access rights. Now, solar panels converting sunlight into electricity sold to tech companies. The land produces. Always. What it produces changes with technology and markets, but the core function remains. The land is a platform for generating revenue. The ranching operation that continues is smaller than the empire at its peak. Fewer acres, fewer cattle, more diversified revenue streams. The work persists because maintaining grass and water and fences and cattle remains necessary as long as livestock operations exist. Cowboys still ride, fences still need repair, wells still pump. The backstage labor that made the empire possible still happens, just at reduced scale. But the story has shifted. The Swenson Empire is no longer defined by what it controls. It is defined by what it was. History, legacy, a name that appears on solar projects and historical markers and cattle brands and county maps. The physical operations are real. The name carries weight beyond those operations. Was Svante Magnus Swenson's vision realized or betrayed? He turned paper into property. His descendants turned property into corporations. Those corporations sold pieces and retained others. The solar project suggests the land is still producing value, just not the kind Swenson could have imagined in 1854 when he started trading blankets for railroad certificates. The work continues on reduced scale, the ownership fragmented across entities and generations. The name appears on projects that may or may not be connected to the family that built the original empire. Cowboys still ride, fences still need repair, wells still pump. But the checks go to different addresses now. And the land that once fed cattle to stockyards will soon feed electricity to data centers. Progress or extraction, vision or opportunism, legacy or transaction. The land is still there, grass still grows, oil still flows when wells produce. Solar panels will convert light to power. And somewhere, a ledger still tracks it all, just like the commissary did in 1900, just like the headquarters did in 1927. The empire split, the pieces sold, the name survived. And in 2027, when 600 megawatts of solar capacity comes online in Stonewall County, the Swenson Ranch name will power solar servers for a company that did not exist when the ranches were at their peak. Svante Magnus Swenson traded blankets for land certificates in 1854. Engie announced a solar project carrying his name in 2025. The land that fed cattle to stockyards will feed electricity to data centers. Same dirt, different use, same name.